Yeah, let's see who's lying. One of us always lies, one of us always tells the truth. Nathan Ward, who was an editor with American Heritage, has written for the New York Times and other publications. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, not far from the Redmond. He's the author of Dark Harbor, The War for New York, for the New York Waterfront, and The Lost Detective, The Coming Death Shield. That's true.
I got into the cowboy world, I guess, slightly before the pandemic. I started doing this book, and every library in the world closed down. It's not the worst thing that happened, but it wasn't convenient. I thought I would just read this little preamble that sort of explains a little bit who Charlie Siringo was, how I came to write it. Is this okay without the mic?
I'm really here. I can hear.
You might want to use it for the MCAT folks, but I think they're going to hook you up with a lab.
Oh, if there's a question you have. All right, I'll read my little thing. Son of the Old West was written largely during the pandemic. As other people brought home puppies to lift their spirits, into our house came a 165-year-old bow-legged stranger, along with all his books, clanking around and talking mainly about himself and his favorite horses, showing off his old Colts 45 or snaring bedposts with long tosses of his riata, while also spinning charming, if sometimes contradictory, yarns about the frontier he had known. It is a pleasure, then, to finally send him back out on the trail he loved. Charlie Siringo led a life worthy of his 5 autobiographies, starting with the classic A Texas Cowboy, the Huck Finn of cowboy literature, which appeared the same year as Huck, and later in A Cowboy Detective, which told about his 2 decades playing outlaw as a Pinkerton. Influenced 1920s crime writers such as Hammett, and provoked the agency's long campaign to silence him. When the final call comes, Siringo judged toward the end, I shall have to take my medicine with Satan holding spoon. Except for his beloved first wife, Mamie, his greatest, most loyal friends in an often lonesome dual life were his horses, Whiskey Pete, Damn Fido, Bonaparte, Rowdy, Glen Alpine Jr., Beaten Be Damned, Sailor Gray, and Patsy, who all got their thanks in his memoirs. No other cowboy ever talked about himself so much in print, admired the Texas folklorist and historian J. Frank Dobie, and few had more to talk about. I came to Charlie's story in the Pinkerton archives of the Library of Congress while researching a book about Dashiell Hammett's young career as a detective. While there was little mention of Hammett in the stacks, there was plenty of discussion, good and bad, about Charlie Siringo, including files devoted to his pursuit of the Wild Bunch train robbing gang and several others about the agency's lawsuits to keep him from telling his story. Luckily, since the time when I was working on my Hammett book, scores of frontier newspapers had been brought online. A writer feeling awash in Charlie's various versions could now follow Siringo, even fact-checked him on his odyssey around the West. In Kansas, for instance, where he married and tried briefly to live as a merchant in the 1880s, I even found an unknown gossip column he had written about his neighbors under the alias Dull Knife, a handle he would later use to enter a Denver rodeo while keeping undercover. This book was the longtime enthusiasm of my friend and editor George Gibson, who saw the possibilities of Siringo's odyssey early on. George kept his eye on the wider history to be told, even while Charlie, like a charming loudmouth down the bar, threatened to take over our tale at every narrative turn. It is for the reader to decide if Siringo succeeded in making our history his own. Like many other aging frontiersmen, Charlie ended up in 1920s Hollywood to see what his life might be worth to the movie makers. The book is prefaced with my favorite Siringo quote, a cryptic statement made after 2 decades spent roaming as a detective, learning about what he called human nature. The saying is as handy as it is elusive. Holy smokes and little fishes. What a deceitful world this is. Son of the Old West presents the rugged life that brought him to such a conclusion. Yeah, should we do
Yeah, that's excellent.
any questions or?
I want to start off with the Charlie Siringo's life is grand and epic and goes a lot of different directions. But I think it would help us to kind of understand the Western America that he started his career in.
Well, he saw everything, which makes his story so hard to believe, but after 5 or 6 years, most of it is true. And the things that he exaggerated in his story are always things that he did not see, like someone else's story that he couldn't help improving. But if he talks about, for instance, when he was doing a lot of skinning, if cattle during the winter were about to die, you could help them along and sell the hides. This was okay with many ranchers, but not all. And one of them finally had had enough of his skinning and hired a man to come shoot him. This story is absolutely true because I've fact-checked it 10 different ways. He did come and shoot him in the knee because he was sitting around his campfire like this, so he aimed for his heart, but it went in his leg. And the doctor who was sent for in Deming's Bridge near Matagorda, Texas, he came 25 miles and got there by dawn, took it out. They reacquainted themselves 50 years later when both had moved to Hollywood. The doctor was retired and Siringo had moved there to try and be in movies, but he was a little too old. And they had a dinner and they discussed it, and all of that is still per him, except this writer that I know, Mark Lee Gardner, sent me a book that had been signed by Siringo that was for sale online 2 months ago. And when I opened on my computer, the inscription said, "To Dr. Holton, who pulled it out of my leg once 50 years ago." So it was the doctor's book that his kids had resold or something. I thought if it wasn't true, the doctor would have been very confused every time he opened it up. So that was a sort of confirmation I got after I turned the book in even. So, but you'd think if anything you would exaggerate would be the time you were shot on the frontier, and that was not. Things like what month his wife died in, or he claimed to have been on the famous race of the Robert E. Lee and the Natchez, but where he claimed to jump on was where it ended, as opposed to where it started. Things like that. But he wasn't there, so when you have 5 books tellings of the same story that you're dealing with, you have to learn to weigh them different ways. But if we're talking about the history of the West, yes. He was born in 1855 in Matagorda. His parents were both immigrants. One was Irish, one was Italian. His father died before he could know him. So his mother ran their very small ranch. I mean, it was a farm, but then once the wandering cattle come into it, everything becomes sort of a ranch down there. And so his father registered brands in his name as a birthday present when he was a baby. You could see the way Texas was going to go already. Then by the time he was 12, he did his first ride up the trail. He was a cowboy until he was almost 30, when he met the 15-year-old love of his life in Kansas, and she convinced him to retire and become briefly a merchant, which he did in Caldwell, Kansas. He sold cigars, oysters, ice cream, all of which could be brought on the train. And although I doubted that story too. But how could you sell oysters in Kansas? And 1877, but apparently you could, if they came twice a week. Then he wrote his first memoir of being a cowboy, because he missed it so much. And then the success of that convinced him that they should all move to Chicago so he could oversee the grand second edition of the book. And he was going to be this cowboy literary man. And it's not always a rich life, the writing life. And when he got there, the Haymarket bombings happened, and that, he claims, is what made him go into the Pinkerton office, and he wanted to fight anarchists. And they saw this guy with all these cowboy skills, and he could be a cowboy detective out of the new Denver branch they were going to open. And so they sent him out there without asking, what about this book that you already wrote about your adventures with all the names and the methods? But I don't know why that was not part of the interview, but it was not. But that would be the problem the rest of his life, was he would keep publishing these books, and they would sue him, get an injunction, then he would publish another version, and then he'd have to mortgage his ranch. But I can't think of another writer from history who would keep telling the same story 5 times, just with such ruinous, economic results. But he just felt it was his life, his adventures. In the most famous book, The Cowboy Detective, they changed all the names. He would put up with that, but it was a 2-year fight. And then his last book, Riata and Spurs, he convinced Houghton Mifflin that it had been long enough, that all was forgiven, and he could tell all of the real stories with all the real names. And it got wonderful reviews for about a week. And then the lawyers started writing letters again, and they had to take out 120 pages, and then he died the next year. So, but as a writer, I have to really admire the just keeping at it.
So he clearly had like a lot of chapters in his life.
Yes,
And-
the struggle in telling a history of the Old West, which is my editor's idea, through his wandering adventures, is about as hard as it sounds, because he always broke his books into the cowboy part and the detective part.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do the whole thing and hit on the Transcontinental Railroad, the cattle herds going to Kansas, then the Chicago slaughterhouses, you're going to do all that through his life. I mean, I think we did it, but it was. He does want to take it over at every turn, and because he's so charming, and his storytelling is so, you just want to just end up quoting everything, and that's too deferential as a narrator.
So yeah, I do think that he is an interesting character in the West, in that he contains both parts of the Western United States, the cowboy mythos, the like rough and tumble, self-reliant side.
Yeah.
And even though he was on Pinkerton's side, the intense labor conflicts that marked.
He was in the fight, yeah. And some of those he accepted because they were, they were making fake ore. They weren't dynamiters, or I mean, the later ones he said he regretted working on the opposite side of the working miners, but he thought that they were misled by anarchists, because I mean, I'm just quoting him here. Yes, he did all of that. He saw all the changes in the West, and he saw the beginning of the Westerns in Hollywood, and a lot of those, like William S. Hart, they based their original kind of cowboy heroes on what they had admired in his original book, A Texas Cowboy, which was the first autobiography by an actual cowboy, not a gentleman rancher or, but he is a vexing person sometimes. But what interested me also was he's not a stolid Marshall Dillon You don't know what he's feeling inside, and he never shot anybody. He is an actor and a tracker, and he would infiltrate the gangs and buy them endless rounds of drinks. Which if I have one takeaway from this, it's if you want to make friends, no matter how bad they are, if you keep buying them rounds, they'll eventually let you into their group. So, and he'd make up some that he had a rich father who would stake him, and he could keep buying drinks, and he never knew his father. And so, but that was the Pinkerton money. That was always the rich father. Sometimes he would bring. He would have fake news stories written about his bad deeds back in Texas, or to prove that he was his bona fides. And sometimes he had a watch with different alias initials to prove that was his real name, and it's very clever. And he was just a great actor. So, and sometimes he's a tramp, sometimes he's a mining executive, sometimes he's just a gunfighter on the run from the law. I would think if it was a show, it would be a dream for an actor, because you're playing a different part every week. It's not, good night, Miss Kitty. It's not. Much as I love Gunsmoke, it's not a big stretch.
So let's talk about him as like a personality a little bit more.
Okay.
How was it? I loved how you put that, because that was something that almost came across on the page, how he keeps wanting to take over the story with his own telling. How was it just confirming his telling and finding the ways which he's elaborated others?
Well, I don't think that he had gotten enough credit as a writer. I mean, he's quite an entertaining writer. But because people are fixed on the adventures being real, which they largely are, the man of action stays the main Siringo character. I had a similar thing when I wrote about Hammett, and it turned out a lot of his stories were not true. But that angered people, because for him to be the best detective writer, he has to have first been the first, a great detective, not just soaking it up enough to write well about it, but to have had all this lore be true.
Yeah.
And he's the opposite. He's the actual adventures overcome the prose style. I mean, people don't see him as a writer the way they should, as an adventure writer.
Where do you think he came across that ability to tell his story?
I don't know. He went to school 4 times and he didn't get past the 3rd grade. So, I mean, they did read a lot. I mean, you had a lot of downtime in these cowboy cabins. They would read sometimes just the Sears Roebuck catalog, or the Bible, or sometimes Shakespeare. But I think he was just a really good storyteller in general, like a campfire storyteller. There isn't he sort of happens on the page in the first book, and I was lucky enough to find this, as I said, I just happened to type in Charlie Siringo in Kansas, 1875 to 1885, into newspapers.com, and I got these columns with this guy saying, people keep saying the author of this column is Charlie Siringo. It's absolutely not true. And then I noticed that the column the alias name was Dull Knife, which is what he was called by all his buddies, because he would throw his knife so often at rattlesnakes that when they borrowed his knife, it was always dull. So they called him Dull Knife. So as soon as I knew that the newspaper was using that as the name, that was him. So then there were all these columns that he was writing before he wrote his first book, and it's gossip about who was visiting the town, how tiresome all his wife's relatives were, but just saying, not saying who's writing it. And then every cowboy going through the town would tell him how bad it looked on the range for, the big die-up of 1886, 87 was about to happen with thousands of cattle dying in the winter. And so the fact that he knew all those people also was a clue that he was very recently a cowboy, if not a cowboy.
So I'm going to kind of wrap up my side of the questioning with his adventures, sort of adventures in Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
and how he came there, because that, you talked about how you're kind of writing the history of the West.
That was the assignment.
Yeah.
Yes.
It works, sort of, but, the Hollywood is the terminus of the West.
That's right. And then the myth making, yes.
Yeah, so this is a man who seems like an incredible storyteller, but also somewhat wed to the truth of his own experience. And
I'm always surprised that these guys weren't offended by some of the plots that were used in the early movies, but I think they just were dazzled by all the trick writing and the fact of capturing a pseudo battle at all. He loved all those movies. Yeah, you see 300 guys doing the Oklahoma land rush, which he had seen firsthand. He loved it. He loved it. The only time he got into a film is Tumbleweeds, which was William S. Hart's final film. And Hart had been told by United Artists that he had to cut the movie, which is this epic. He had to cut it down from 8 reels to 5 reels, and he refused. And one of the benefits of his refusal, it meant that they didn't release it in a full national release because they were so mad, and it failed, and it was his final film. But if he had cut it down, he would have cut out things like the cameo he gave to Siringo. So it's the only footage of Siringo at all is he's in the bar the night before the big land rush. He's playing some strange instrument. You can't even see. It's out of this frame. And it's like a miracle to see him in there. He's got his big hat, and he's so shiny tan from his life outside. So it was too bad for the gate for Tumbleweeds. But at least you can see, if you go on YouTube, there's about 5 different versions of it. He's about 57 minutes into the first hour. He just suddenly appears for about 4 seconds. And it's clear he's not an actor.
So I know that you wanted to share a passage from this.
Well, I could read something if you want.
Yeah, I love that.
All right. We could do, let's see. We could do him on one of his, yeah, let's do, this is just a little thing. Sometimes these Pinkertons would be sent into the jails as a pretend prisoner to get confessions out of the other guys in there. And in this case, he was sent in as a supposed wife murderer from Cheyenne, and that he just needed to be in here while they build his gallows, and then he's gone. Because you're going to tell anything to someone you think is dying anyway. And so it starts in Gunnison County, Colorado, in 1888. I'll just read till he gets his confession. The train platform was covered with snow, as were the surrounding streets, as 4 men, cuffed and shackled, were led trudgingly the slushy half-mile from the depot to the city jail. The morning sidewalks were standing room for the curious, as the scruffy prisoners passed, unwashed and unrepentant, and apparently just dragged from the wilderness. Sheriff Cyrus Doc Shores was marching them to his small jail in Gunnison County, Colorado, in the spring of 1888. Doc Shores occasionally consulted with Charles Eames, superintendent of the Denver office, as a Pinkerton special operative. He was investigating a robbery from the previous November of a passenger train on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad near Grand Junction, Colorado. The robbers had disappeared into the woods for several months near Green River, Utah. Two were Kansas farm brothers named Smith. Their third man was Ed Rhodes. Enlisted to find them with Shores, Siringo had visited the Smith family's farm outside Cawker City, Kansas, as a potential buyer, flirting long enough with Farmer Smith's black-eyed daughter to gain access to her letters from the train robbers. In his dealings with young women related to his subjects, Siringo often reported he had to fall in love with her, a phrase that had a broader meaning then, but he does seem to have done whatever we care to imagine for his job with his wife's alleged permission. After stealing their last known posting address and studying the Smith family photos, Charlie quickly cooled on the poor girl and lost interest in her father's farm as well. Hearing that the three men had been flushed and trapped, Siringo switched roles, posing now as an escaped wife killer from Wyoming taken into Doc Shore's custody somewhere along the Gunnison River. At the depot in Montrose, Colorado, Shores cuffed and shackled Siringo before they boarded the train that was already carrying the captured fugitives and supervising officers. In the smoking car, the four prisoners sullenly rode to Gunnison, where they were to be cellmates eating meals prepared upstairs by the sheriff's wife and given a few greasy quilts. In some ways, prison life was an improvement, Ed Rhodes told Doc. He hadn't been warm or had a square meal since the robbery. The tight cell they would share had a bloody recent history, which Shores exploited to psychological advantage on his guests. He had once arrested the Colorado cannibal Alfred Packard, accused of eating 5 of his snowbound traveling companions in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado during the hard winter of 1874. The Gunnison cell was also still spotted with blood from a recent suicide, upon being told he would be brought back east for trial by the great Pinkerton detective James McParland. A prisoner who had escaped the Molly Maguire prosecutions and hangings pulled a razor from beneath his mattress, declared, "Mac will never get me alive," and cut his own throat, tossing the bloody blade to the windowsill in grisly victory. The Kansas train robbers Shores was now holding got to know their cellmate, Charlie Lawrence, the slender wife killer awaiting escort back to Wyoming for his hanging. During their long nights locked up together, the Kansans shared many secrets with their small, worldly friend, who confided in turn about breaking out of the Cheyenne jail. Having just spent months in Cheyenne and thereabouts searching for an escaped convict, Charlie spoke with authority about the details of the bust-out. Siringo spent 2 weeks hamming it up with his rank cellmates, who were alive with vermin from their miserable time in the wild. One brother wearing a kerchief over a festering, unhealed head wound from the other brother's mistaken shotgun blast. But they had shared many secrets by the time the prisoners parted, when the undersheriff came at last to get Charlie for his long train ride to the gallows. "I had confided in my companions," he wrote. "The prisoners really shed tears when I shook hands with them before being handcuffed to the supposed officers." Then he was gone. Outside the jail, Charlie Lawrence passed along to Doc Shores all he had learned from the Kansans about the logistics of their train heist. Feeling the sheriff now already knew too much, the men offered up the rest. Then, turning the page on his weeks of ripe camaraderie, Charlie washed up and caught the return train to Denver. That's a couple days in life.
Is that an example of what happens in the whole book? I mean, is it always that?
I don't know if it's always as grisly funny as those hoped to be. But that's another problem with his life is entirely episodes. And so you can decide one deserves to be the opener and then decide another one I went back and forth. I started with the Butch Cassidy part, then at one point I had this as the opener. It's like it's the James Bond before the opening credits thing. They're running down the hill, they're chasing him, but it could be any of them. And then he lands on the boat and says traffic was terrible.
With that, let's hear some more from the audience and some more audience questions.
Why do you think he's been so relatively unknown? I mean, history, because he sounds like.
Because he played so many people.
I'm sorry?
Because he played so many people.
Oh,
When he,
okay.
by the time he got to Hollywood, Wyatt Earp was there, a lot of the surviving, frontiersmen were wandering around trying to get their stories bought. And he had played dozens of other people. He was known for writing his first book, but you're not going to make a movie out of that. So he was mostly used for authenticity. People would check their stories with him. He was taken to a lot of parties in the Hollywood Hills, but they didn't buy anything from him. Finally, William S. Hart, as I said, he let him work on that movie, and they recreated Caldwell, Kansas, basically from his remembrances, and the bar and where everything happened. So he did have that right towards the end, but yeah, nobody made a Charlie Siringo story. But if you watch Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they keep saying, "Who are those guys?" and they're chasing him and chasing him, those are the Pinkertons and the railroad detectives. They just don't name them.
Who were the Pinkertons' clients? Was it
Well,
mostly the railroads?
well, you really can watch the West change by who were the Pinkertons' clients, because they followed the money. In the 1870s, it's mostly the railroads and the robbery, and then that's their heroic era. And then later, when the mining violence was happening, and then they were brought in, and that's what they're mostly known for. The average person thinks of them as strike breakers, and that's later, and that's also after the old man had died. And his sons divided the place, the business, and so he did some of that, but he started with the others. So that's why he's a good, without judging his behavior, one or the other, you really can follow the West through his career and through their career. And then the very Pinkerton archive at the Library of Congress was donated to clean up their image. So it's all Butch Cassidy and train robbers and all the great jobs that they did in the 1870s and 1880s, and it was donated after all the labor laws changed in the 30s, and we have to do something about our image if we're going to survive. And so, if you go there, it's a wonderful trove. You've got your cipher books, your wanted posters, everything you could want to see. If you're interested in detectives at all, it's all there, and it can't be online. It comes to you in boxes, and it's just junk, but very meaningful junk, and diaries, and but there's very very little mining stuff. So there's the train stuff, and then there's what I found was all their legal cases against him. So there's file after file after file of how the latest Siringo case is going, and at the same time they have all his reports in there about when he's infiltrating the Wild Bunch. So it's a very strange duality in the same place. But I never knew any of that until I was looking for Dashiell Hammett, who's not there at all. But there was plenty of Siringo, and that's so. Well, I mean, he didn't have as long a career with them either, but he's really about 3 years, and he was low level. He was Baltimore operative, and there are various reasons. One is that the client kept reports. They were the client's property, so most of them are not in the archive. But those that are there are very interesting because that's clearly the template that the Hammett's op stories came from, is writing these things. And sometimes there's always a warehouse fire. People are, when you're looking for things, there's like, oh, there was the fire of 1973, and all that stuff's gone. But But there was lots of on him, so I copied it while I was there because I didn't have as much Hammett as I had hoped. And when every library in the world closed down, especially the Library of Congress, I had all this stuff in my study that I had something to work on because in the meantime I had signed to write this book, and now I couldn't go back to the Library of Congress. But I, just out of curiosity, I'd made all these copies.
And I think it's fascinating, his acting as an undercover
Yeah.
guy. And it's interesting to me because I knew an FBI agent who was a supervisor of an organized crime task force in the 1980s.
Oh, yeah.
He was a frustrated writer. He would create these elaborate undercover scenarios with himself a star.
Yeah.
I mean, not just him, but he would be, with yachts, and, he'd be, a rich investor in Las Vegas, all these various different things, and he did it. He really did it brilliantly. And he was also brilliant about choosing people to kind of work with him. And I remember this one Korean American police officer who was undercover had actually studied with Stella Adler, who was Brando's coach back in the 50s. So these guys, when they get into it, they seem like they really get into it.
He was getting his inner experiences into the role.
Yeah. And being a frustrated writer, too, he would really create the whole thing. And I wonder the degree to which your guy, did similar sorts of things.
Well, like I say, the mystery to me is that they didn't, the fact of his best-selling first book didn't come up in the interview. So you loved writing about your own adventures and all the people that you meet. Come on board.
Yeah.
I mean, he must have just been he had such a skill set that they wanted.
Right.
Or it didn't come up. I don't know. It's not in his, he got a letter, he was recommended by Pat Garrett, the killer of Billy the Kid, because he had been on the hunt for Billy the Kid, although he wasn't in the real posse. Because Pat Garrett didn't like civilian posses. He called them a whirlwind of lunatics.
Yeah.
Which works for a lot of things. But anyway, he had recommendation from him and his banker, but there's nothing about his book or him being a writer. So I guess they didn't ask any other questions. It seems unlike them. I wish. I wasted much of the spring on something that turned back into what we used to call a magazine story. But there used to be, there's magazine stories, there's book ideas, and then a lot of magazine stories became books. But this is what I would. It was a cowboy mutiny. These three guys found themselves on a British frigate in 1902. They'd never been on a ship before, and they wanted off, but they knew that Pitcairn Island was where the pirates from the mutiny on the Bounty had gone, and that was only 300 miles away. So they shot the captain, they built a little raft, they threw it over. No one knows what happened to them, but it was presumed that the sharks and the waves and and then one of the crew was wandering Arizona 2 years later, and they said, it's funny I see you, because, Hobbs, one of the mutineers, is now the sheriff over in Bisbee. You can see why this is an exciting story, right? So then the British government sent their guy down from San Francisco. They had a whole trial over whether he should be removed to Great Britain and put on trial for murder. And the problem was he was a sheriff. So every time he had arrested people, it was in the newspaper. So he had a very good alibi. But I wanted it to be true. So I sent away, I got 700 pages of testimony from archives in Liverpool, and the National Archives had one, and the Arizona State House had one. So but he's just not guilty. But in the movie, he would be, right? How do they got him, and then you have a cowboy story that's also a maritime. I mean, that's just too good, and you get to go to Pitcairn Island. So that was a hard blow when that was not true. But so I just did it as a magazine story.
I want to go back to Charlie. What happened to him in the end? Did some of this undercover type of thing catch up with him?
Well, I do think that it was damaging to be sort of in that murky in between all the time. And in some of these cases, the guys would get off, and he would be cheered, having provided all the evidence that brought them to trial. They were his friends by then, not all of them, but you could see where he was living, and so of course none of his marriages held together, and he was gone 6-7 months at a time on these cases. And then by the time he got to Hollywood, he was quite sick with bronchitis, and he could have done trick riding and all the other things that were called for when they were making lots of Westerns, but he was just too sickly, and he was about 75, when 75 was old.
I actually flipped, the moment Barbara asked that, I thought of 294, the passage from Herbert Nibs.
Oh, this from a news story?
Yeah. Just yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is when his last book came out, it did really well for a week before the Pinkertons heard about it. There's this one guy named John Brown who his main job was just shutting down his books for 30 years. And then in the 1940s, he was still giving lectures about it at the Stockman's Club or something. Everybody would come to hear stories about Charlie Siringo, and he would tell about prosecuting Charlie Siringo and how charming he was when he gave his deposition. But they'd still come. This is his piece about him that was in the Los Angeles Times when they called him Ulysses of the Wild West, which was my original title for this book. But some people wondered whether enough people still knew who Ulysses was, or they would think it was Ulysses Grant, or I don't know. So
You'd probably get some Joyce play out here.
Yeah, I just
like,
didn't.
I
thought if they don't know, then I'd give up. But anyway, I was convinced to come up with this title instead. Weather and rough trails have aged him beyond his years, and yet he has retained the heart of a boy. The word detective is a rather clammy sort of word. Charlie Siringo wasn't that kind of a detective. Although he worked for the Pinkertons, he was really an itinerant officer of the law, often doing what local officers were paid to do but didn't. He couldn't be bribed, and he wouldn't be scared, and he didn't get killed, and it is the eighth wonder of the world that he wasn't killed. Yeah, that's Herbert Nibs, who is unfortunately is the one who recommended him to his editor at Houghton Mifflin, and he did his last book and was sued, and then died sort of heartbroken. But he didn't know that. He's trying to help him out.
So were the Pinkertons, I mean, I'm assuming they probably weren't used to people crossing.
Well, and particularly, they got to tell their stories. So the old man he has so many bestsellers, ghostwritten, about the Molly Maguires or all their big cases of the 80s. And a lot of them were made into Broadway stage shows, like James McParland, who was their most famous detective. He broke the Molly Maguire case, and then there was a Broadway show called McParland the Detective, He saw no money from that. And then the book was written by Alan Pinkerton, and he got no money of that. The last Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes is a sort of redo of that book. And then after that, he and the Pinkertons wouldn't speak to each other. But he claimed he'd loaned it to him on a transatlantic cruise, and then he turned it into this Holmes's Last Adventure.
So it's like he was, their big objection was not the story was being told. It was,
Well, also that, I mean, he's giving away the clients' names. That's not cool. Even as a writer, I'd have to say, it is sort of what he signed. But you would have think by the last one, in 1925, that it had been long enough. But it was the principle. They had a signed injunction, and so all the files, they have the inter-office memos, and what there's all caps. It is not our job to sympathize with old Charlie. It is just to shut it down, because a lot of these people had worked with him in the field, and now they were heads of local offices, and they were charged with doing this business.
I just have more of a comment. I always thought the concept of unauthorized autobiography was rather humorous
Yeah.
in itself. But Charlie really seems like somebody who is the king of the unauthorized autobiography.
That is true. He did it 5 times. Well, no, the first one's, there's no problem with the first one, because that's just the cowboy stuff.
So, you keep talking about like doing all this archival work.
Yeah.
To drag this all out. How is it confirming stories that are now 100 years gone?
Well, in this case, I was very lucky that so many of these newspapers, frontier newspapers, are now online, because when I couldn't go anywhere, I could still do searches, and I could still read, for instance, the guy who ran the grocery store where he met his first wife in Caldwell, Kansas. He wrote that story in a little newspaper when Charlie's second to last book came out. It was his opportunity to tell that he was there when they met, and he was, asking his advice on what kind of boots to wear to church, and because he was very nervous about impressing her father. And I wouldn't have found any of that if I had just relied on the books. And but so much of that stuff is online. You do have to know sort of what you're looking for, but you got a lot from that. A lot of newspapers. I mean, you can't always trust the newspapers, but in that case, I did trust them because it was more likely than the way Charlie tells it. He sounds like much more controlled the situation.
Yeah. We got time for one more question from the audience.
I got a question.
Yeah.
You talked about how charming he was.
Apparently he was.
Do you think he was a sociopath? The reason I ask is, again, I'm thinking of my friend who was in the undercover in the FBI.
Well, if you stay too long, yeah.
And he wrestled with the ethics of deception.
Yep.
And he finally decided that you're living and work with somebody for so long, and you're deceiving them, you're lying to them, that the loyalty was not to the person, but to society, ultimately. And whatever relationship that you had with the criminal, couldn't weigh against your responsibility to society. And I'm curious, we talk about a lot of cops being sociopaths.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I do think that he never grew up. So, I mean, that's less of a judgment. I think he was about 15 his whole life, which is a great time, depending on what you've got going on. But I don't think he was briefly married to the love of his life, had a daughter, then she died of pleurisy, his wife did, And after that, he seems to have just done his job. He would marry and sort of expect the new wife to want to live on his Santa Fe ranch that was near nothing, with nothing to do, and no one else, I mean, the caretaker. And then he would be hurt when each one of them was bored and left him and went back home. And then he would sort of do it again. But I don't think he thought about his life as a grown-up person again after the death of his first wife. And that's as far as I can psychoanalyze him. I mean, he's always, the things that he left out of his books are significant, but they're with an imagined reader in mind, not that he was not thinking about them. And again, since he never shot anybody, I guess I would call him, but yeah, he could be a sociopath, sure. But, in a charming way.
The sense I always got from him was that he had a profound capacity for empathy, and that's how he could relate to so many people.
Yes, he did, and he did empathize with these guys that he was supposed to throw over for his job.
But he also had a switch.
Yeah, but sometimes he felt terrible, and other times he could always see that if, for instance, there was a time when he was about 12, and he got in a fight with the bully. I mean, there was a lot of bullies when he was a kid. I think because he was sort of runty. He was about 5'3", 130 pounds as a grown man. And so he was always getting picked on when he was young. And he took his knife that he had just been given by sort of adoptive parents in New Orleans, and he cut him all along the back. And when he would be with these gangs later, he would realize that if that had gone differently, if he had killed that kid, he would be just like these guys. And I think that's how he felt about some of those relationships later on, is that, it's that one break.
I guess I kind of want to end on this note. If you had to make one modification to the epitaph on Charlie Siringo's life, what would it be? What would be your final word on Charlie Siringo? It could be something that you want people to take away from the book. It could be something that you don't get to talk about.
Well, I'm sorry he didn't get the epitaph that he wanted, but it's a very long epitaph. I mean, he had an unmarked grave until the 90s, and some fan paid for him because he had two children from different families, different wives, and they met for the purposes of getting this done, and they didn't meet ever after that. And then most of his belongings that were with his son they went up in a tenant's house fire. So some of the things that they could have sold went up in this fire, but what he wanted on his tomb was, "When my old soul hunts range and rest beyond the last divide, just plant me on some strip of west that's sunny, lone, and wide. Let cattle rub my headstone round, and coyotes wail their kin. Let horses come and paw the mound, but don't you fence it in." I mean, there aren't that many tombs that would fit on, but that's what he wanted.
Alrighty, thank you so much.
Well, sure, my pleasure.